Hi, I'm sci-fi and fantasy author Michael LaVoice, aka LaVoice, in your head, and I'm fitting to talk nerdy with you. I've mentioned before on this channel a story called The Prisoner of Zenda, and how it had one of my favorite villains of all time in the movie version. He was pretty freaking cool in the book, too. And that got me to thinking about other stories that were considered classics, and could they make it in today's market? I don't think Les Mis would have made it into modern publishing world. You get to that 50 pages description of the sewer system of Paris, and I think any editor in his right mind just say it smelled bad and move on, right? So the classics are there. They're a reflection of their time, right? The mores, the way of speaking, we get to see how language evolves over time. The cool thing is, I wouldn't have found some of these classics without reading modern science fiction. For example, I would never have found The Prisoner of Zenda without reading a science fiction series called The Time Wars by Simon Hawke. He wrote a book called The Zenda Vendetta, in which the events of Anthony Hope's novel turned out to be historical, and a terrorist organization called the Timekeepers had traveled back in time and meddled in those events by killing Rudolf Rassendyll on the train to Ruritania before he even got there. So it created a temporal anomaly, and in response, these time commandos had to go back in time to fix it. And this guy named Finn Delaney has to impersonate Rassendyll and play out the story. Almost the exact same story follows, with some science fiction elements tossed in. Now, all the classic story elements were there, including the doomed romance. The character arc was there too, because up until then, Delaney had been kind of a side character in the novels and a bit of a layabout, really, if we're going to be honest. And through this story, his arc changed and he became a real stand-up guy, just like Rudolph did in the original story. And that's kind of where the magic lies. The elements of story that we as a species have been using since we just sat around campfires embellishing the details of the day's hunt haven't changed. We expect them in one form or another in any story, or in the proper order, right? Or the story rings false somehow. It isn't as good. But just as we no longer sit around campfires and spinning yarns as much as we used to collectively, story consumption and format changes, language evolution, and the way stories get told, all of that changed. So there are many ways to tell a story now, but the classics remain classics for a reason. That said, just like Les Mis, there are some other classics that may never become modern day masterpieces. For example, Three Musketeers, right? Okay. I've tried to read it. I've tried to read it several times. It was also adapted by Simon Hawke for the Time War series, but I was looking for good quotes to put out on my socials. You know, I do those quotes from books from time to time, and I found a great speech from D'Artagnan's dad in the opening chapters. The problem was, it's a 2-page speech. That's not an exaggeration. And the frustrating part is, if you chop it up for brevity, it loses a lot of its charm. It's a good section of the book, but any modern editor would have put the brakes on that in a New York Minute and made the author revise it. Yeah, Mr. Dumas, hi, it's your editor. Yeah, this send-off scene between your MC and his father, it's really tender and nice, but I'm going to need you to knock that down to a couple of paragraphs and just move on. Then again, all the classic elements are still there. In this time you have 4 heroes to choose from, each one with a bit of an arc, even though the focus is obviously on D'Artagnan. Even that awful Disney version of Young Guns with Swords got that bit right. And the BBC figured out that a novel of that length makes for a wonderful miniseries. But I've also noticed a drastic reduction in prologues and epilogues in modern fiction. Readers have largely lost patience for them. They want to be tossed into the story right away and want the story started as close to the ending as possible, without losing any of the classic elements that spell out character arcs, the stakes, the thrill elements, and emotional satisfaction resolutions, and all that, the plots and the subplots. This is all dependent on genre, though. I mean, the amount of setup required for crime fiction is different than a romance or a thriller or a mill sci-fi epic. They all have their genre-specific pacing and execution. Nowadays, depending on genre, readers demand far less setup. They want a hook at the beginning, some bit of action to pull them into the story, and it better have something to do with the actual story in some way, or they accuse you of just using a cheap action hook to draw them in, even though that's exactly what you did. The tropes exist because they work. They are what build stories, and readers notice when you leave them out of order or misuse them. Now, that's not to say the tropes and genres can't be bent and blended a little here and there. We've talked about that before, too. Add a dash of romance to the adventure story, adding a little action to the intellectual mystery solving is another one. Arthur Conan Doyle did it better. I don't know if he did it first, but he definitely did it better. Having your detective also be a back alley philosopher, that's a nice twist too, but Raymond Chandler already did it better. You get the point. I hear various writers and readers disparaging the classics and praising them for the same features. Strip away some of the features of the era in which the classics were written, however, and you find the bones of a good story holding it all together. And a lot can be learned from them. Yes, our collective attention span has shortened. And yes, there is much more content competing for our ever-shortening attention spans. But I highly encourage you, if you've not taken the time to read your way through a classic or two, to do so. You might have to look up a few words and deal with some uncomfortable worldviews, or even confront some past awkward ugliness head on, culturally speaking. But much like the heroes and heroines of the classics, you'll come out on the other end changed for the better. There's lots out there. Expand your horizons a bit. Take a chance and let me know how it goes.